He could almost taste the sweetness of freedom, but every time James bit into something he craved, it felt like his body betrayed him all over again. He was only 47, but after a decade of fighting rising blood sugar levels, a doctor's warning had finally shaken him to his core. If you don't change now, you could lose your eyesight, or worse. That night, lying awake as the moonlight spilled across his kitchen floor, James rummaged through his memories of meals past. The scent of warm pastries, the soft chew of white bread, these were his comforts, his traditions, but also the very things that had pushed him to the brink. His hands trembled as he opened his fridge, staring down the silent armies of processed food that had conquered his life. He realized in a wave of both shame and determination that he needed a different kind of arsenal, foods that could fight for him, not against him. That was when he started scouring every dusty corner of his mother's old cookbooks, desperate for a lifeline. It wasn't enough to simply avoid sugar. James wanted to eat things that could actively lower his blood glucose and give him a real chance at reclaiming his health. He discovered, hidden between recipes for sugary pies and heavy casseroles, 3 ingredients so powerful that they read like legends whispered in diabetic support groups. Foods that could nourish his body while taming the spikes and crashes that made every day feel like a tightrope walk over disaster. The first revelation came in the form of dark leafy greens, the unassuming heroes of the vegetable world. Kale, spinach, collard greens, these weren't just garnishes or side dishes, they were potent shields against rising blood sugar. James learned that these greens are rich in magnesium, a mineral that helps improve insulin sensitivity by allowing glucose to enter cells more effectively. The fiber content of these vegetables also slows the digestion of carbohydrates, blunting blood sugar surges after meals. Studies he uncovered late at night, blinking in the blue glow of his laptop, showed that people who eat a diet high in dark leafy greens have a significantly reduced risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and for those already battling it, like James, they can help stabilize levels with every bite. As he began tossing spinach into omelets and massaging kale into hearty salads, he noticed that not only did his glucose readings drop, but his energy and mood improved too. He felt like he was waking up from a years-long fog. His second discovery was hiding in plain sight at the bottom of his spice rack: cinnamon. James had always associated cinnamon with sweet treats and holiday nostalgia, but he never knew it could be the secret weapon his body was craving. Research pointed him to the compound cinnamaldehyde, which appears to mimic insulin and improve glucose uptake by cells. In clinical trials, people with type 2 diabetes who consumed as little as half a teaspoon of cinnamon daily saw significant reductions in fasting blood sugar levels. James started stirring cinnamon into plain Greek yogurt, adding it to unsweetened oatmeal, and even brewing it into tea. The warmth of the spice didn't just comfort him emotionally, it worked at a cellular level to help restore balance. The more he embraced cinnamon as a daily ritual, the more stable his blood sugar charts became, no longer the erratic peaks and valleys that left him drained and anxious, but a smooth line that gave him hope he hadn't felt in years. The third and perhaps most surprising champion came from his grandmother's cherished kitchen garden: legumes. Lentils, chickpeas, black beans, foods James had ignored for most of his life, suddenly emerged as life-saving staples. Their low glycemic index and unique starch structure mean they break down slowly in the digestive tract, providing a steady, prolonged release of glucose into the bloodstream. Unlike the roller coaster of refined carbohydrates, legumes offer a gentle slope, keeping energy levels consistent and reducing the burden on insulin production. Rich in protein, fiber, and essential nutrients, these humble beans also help curb appetite and promote heart health, two critical concerns for anyone managing diabetes. James found that replacing white rice with lentils or tossing chickpeas into his salads didn't just lower his post-meal blood sugar, it left him feeling satisfied, empowered, and finally in control of his destiny. As weeks turned into months, James's nightly blood sugar checks became less terrifying. His doctor, once a harbinger of doom, now greeted him with cautious optimism. Friends noticed the spark returning to his eyes, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. He knew he hadn't discovered a miracle cure. Diabetes still lurked in the shadows, waiting for him to slip. But with dark leafy greens, cinnamon, and legumes anchoring his meals, James felt armed and ready to fight for every day he wanted to live. He started sharing his journey with anyone who would listen. Family members who dismissed his struggles as self-inflicted, co-workers who secretly feared the same fate, strangers at the farmer's market who hesitated in front of the kale stand. James became an evangelist for food as medicine, recounting how every forkful of these three foods helped him reclaim pieces of himself that diabetes had tried to steal: his energy, his optimism, his sense of agency. He even hosted Sunday dinners, where he showed his skeptical friends that a lentil stew, bursting with herbs and crowned with a sprinkle of cinnamon, could taste as rich and comforting as any takeout order and leave them feeling energized instead of sluggish. The deeper he dug into the science behind his new way of eating, the more convinced he became that these foods weren't just good for diabetics, they were essential. Studies from institutions like the American Diabetes Association and journals such as Diabetes Care validated what he was experiencing firsthand. Dark leafy greens provided critical antioxidants that helped reduce inflammation, a silent contributor to insulin resistance. Cinnamon didn't just lower blood sugar, but improved cholesterol profiles, reducing the risk of heart disease, a leading cause of death for diabetics. Legumes proved time and again to support gut health, modulate appetite hormones, and reduce blood sugar spikes, helping break the vicious cycle of hunger and cravings that James knew all too well. He found a new rhythm to his days. Mornings began with a spinach and kale scramble, brightened with diced tomatoes and a dusting of cinnamon. Lunch often featured hearty lentil soups or chickpea salads tossed in lemony vinaigrette. Snacks of roasted chickpeas replaced the sugary granola bars that used to haunt his desk drawer. And dinner became an opportunity to experiment, layering greens into curries, simmering beans into stews, and discovering the endless ways these foods could not only lower his blood sugar, but also fill his life with flavor and joy. James' transformation didn't just show up in his glucose readings. His skin cleared, his mind sharpened, and he found himself moving through the world with a sense of lightness he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. Friends who once pitied him for his diagnosis now looked to him for advice, and his relationship with food shifted from adversarial to celebratory. Meals were no longer a battlefield. They were a daily affirmation of his commitment to living well, not just surviving. Perhaps most importantly, James learned that this wasn't about deprivation. The myth that diabetes management must mean endless bland salads and sad, tasteless meals was shattered. In embracing dark leafy greens, cinnamon, and legumes, he discovered a culinary adventure rich in textures, colors, and traditions. Recipes inspired by cuisines around the world, from spicy Indian dal to savory Ethiopian misir wat, became his allies, teaching him that healthy food could be as exciting and indulgent as anything he'd ever craved. Looking back on the night he first stood in his kitchen, terrified and alone, James marveled at how much power he'd gained simply by changing what he chose to put on his plate. His story became a testament to countless others that managing diabetes doesn't have to mean surrender. It can be a revolution, a daily act of reclaiming health and hope. James's newfound passion soon blossomed beyond his own kitchen. He started volunteering at a local community center, where many residents struggled with diabetes but lacked access to reliable nutrition advice. He shared his recipes and the simple truth he wished he'd known years earlier. Food could be the fiercest medicine or the deadliest poison. and just 3 humble staples, dark leafy greens, cinnamon and legumes, could tip the scales in their favor. In classes held on folding chairs in church basements and community halls, James watched the light return to people's eyes as they realized they, too, could take charge of their blood sugar without expensive diets or miracle pills. He guided them through meal prep nights, teaching them to saute collard greens until tender, sprinkle cinnamon over roasted sweet potatoes, and simmer lentils until creamy and deeply flavorful. He told them the same story he'd told himself when he first found the courage to change. Every meal is a chance to heal. As word spread, James received messages from strangers who'd heard about the 3 foods that saved a man's life. They asked if it was really possible, if a handful of greens, a dash of cinnamon, and a scoop of beans could make that much difference. He shared his story over and over, each time adding the new research he kept uncovering. Recent studies showing that people who eat legumes 4 times a week lower their risk of type 2 diabetes by up to 33%. Trials confirming that cinnamon can reduce fasting blood sugar by 10 to 29%. Reports revealing how dark leafy greens can help the body produce glutathione, an antioxidant that protects beta cells in the pancreas, the very cells that produce insulin. He learned that these foods were more than just blood sugar regulators. They were lifelines for his heart, liver and kidneys, organs under constant siege from the complications of diabetes. His A1C, a 3-month average of blood sugar levels, dropped from a dangerous 9.4% to a remarkable 6.1% in less than a year. His cholesterol numbers improved, his blood pressure normalized, and the neuropathy that had started tingling in his feet began to fade. Every morning he could feel his toes was a victory he celebrated with a quiet smile. The ripple effects of his story began changing his family too. His teenage daughter, who once rolled her eyes at his rabbit food, started requesting spinach quesadillas. His wife, who'd feared every doctor's appointment would bring more bad news, found herself inspired to overhaul her own meals, adding chickpeas and kale to their shared table. Even his skeptical older brother, who had always dismissed James's health struggles as bad luck, called to ask for his favorite lentil curry recipe after his own doctor warned him he was pre-diabetic. And in that moment, James realized that what started as a desperate fight for his life had grown into something far bigger, a movement of people taking back control, one meal at a time. He began dreaming of a cookbook, one that didn't just list recipes but told the stories of hope behind each dish. He imagined chapters like The Greens That Saved Me, Cinnamon, Sweet Spice, Serious Power, and Beans That Beat the Odds, each filled with practical guidance and heartfelt reminders that change was possible. Night after night, as he set his dinner plate on the table, James thought back to that night when he stood in the moonlit kitchen on the verge of surrender. He no longer felt alone. He felt part of a community of fighters, people who refused to let diabetes define them, who discovered the courage to heal by embracing the simple, powerful gifts of the earth. As the seasons passed, James's journey from despair to empowerment began to attract the attention of local media. A small newspaper ran a feature titled, "Man Beats Diabetes with 3 Foods Anyone Can Afford," and soon he found himself on the evening news, his face lit with the same determination that had carried him through those first terrifying nights of change. Standing before cameras in his modest kitchen, James chopped kale and simmered lentils, his hands steady and confident as he explained how these foods helped him rewrite his story. Calls flooded in from viewers desperate for hope, from elderly couples tired of pill bottles cluttering their counters to young parents terrified by new diagnoses. James answered every message with patient encouragement, sharing not only his recipes, but also his hard-won understanding that diabetes isn't just a battle of willpower. It's a battle of knowledge, community, and small, consistent choices. He reminded each person that they didn't have to tackle it alone, and that real change came not from overnight miracles, but from daily victories, like choosing lentil soup over instant noodles or swapping a sugary dessert for Greek yogurt dusted with cinnamon. With support from his community center and a growing group of volunteers inspired by his transformation, James launched a series of free cooking workshops called The Power of Three. Each week, families gathered around borrowed crockpots and battered skillets, laughing as they massaged kale, gasping in delight at the warm, comforting scent of cinnamon wafting through the room, and marveling at how simple it could be to turn humble beans into something hearty and satisfying. James watched friendships form over cutting boards, and he realized that food didn't just nourish bodies, it built connections strong enough to fight the isolation and shame so many diabetics carried. Meanwhile, James's own health continued to improve in ways that shocked even his doctor. His risk of heart attack, once alarmingly high, fell as his cholesterol stabilized. The stubborn pounds that had clung to his frame melted away, replaced with lean muscle from the walks he now enjoyed every morning, his joints no longer aching under the strain of inflammation. His mind, once fogged by wild blood sugar swings, felt sharp and clear. He could remember conversations, focus on work, and savor each moment with his family without the constant cloud of fatigue. He even began experimenting with international cuisines that celebrated his three miracle foods, from fragrant Ethiopian misewot simmered with lentils and berbere, to silky Indian saag paneer packed with spinach, to Moroccan tagines seasoned with cinnamon and sweet spices that balanced savory beans. He found himself excited for meals in a way he hadn't been since childhood, discovering flavors that made him feel alive instead of deprived. Yet James never forgot the fear that had first gripped him, or the countless others who still faced it alone. He wrote articles for local newsletters, started a podcast to share success stories from others who'd embraced the same foods, and partnered with farmers markets to offer discounts on greens and legumes for those managing diabetes. His mission became clear: to spread the word that these three foods, dark leafy greens, cinnamon and legumes, could be the difference between a life of silent suffering and one of vibrant health. In quiet moments, James reflected on how far he'd come. He remembered nights when he thought he'd never see his daughter graduate high school or dance with his wife at their anniversary. Now, every day felt like a second chance, a chance he seized gratefully with every bite of kale salad, every spoonful of lentil stew, every warm mug of cinnamon tea. He knew the fight wasn't over. Diabetes would always require vigilance, but he also knew he'd armed himself with knowledge, habits, and a community that gave him the strength to keep going. The more James leaned into his mission, the more he realized that his personal story was only the beginning of a much larger movement. He began collaborating with local dietitians, nurses, and diabetes educators who were thrilled to see a patient not only thriving, but inspiring others. They invited him to speak at clinics where newly diagnosed patients sat wide-eyed and terrified, overwhelmed by pamphlets listing forbidden foods and dire complications. James stood before them not as a doctor or a lecturer, but as living proof that change was possible, sharing the same three foods that had given him his life back. He saw tears of relief in the eyes of people who, like him, thought diabetes was a one-way ticket to blindness, amputations, or an early grave. He answered their questions with humility and honesty, never promising magic, always reminding them that small, consistent shifts could move mountains. He knew how hard it was to make those first changes alone, so he offered to come to their homes, cook alongside them, and show them how to transform a bag of dried lentils or a bundle of collard greens into meals they'd actually look forward to. Soon he was being invited to schools, helping kids understand the power of food before habits became hard to break. He led garden projects where children planted kale and spinach, beaming with pride when their first crops sprouted. He showed them how to sprinkle cinnamon into smoothies and stir it into yogurt, how to cook lentils with spices that turned simple beans into something extraordinary. These kids weren't just learning to cook, they were growing up with the knowledge that their choices could shape their futures, and the futures of their families. James's kitchen became a revolving door of neighbors, friends, and newcomers eager to learn his recipes and share their own struggles. His once lonely dinner table was now a gathering place for laughter, support, and determination. Strangers became friends, and friends became allies in the fight against a disease that had long thrived on silence and misinformation. Together, they swapped stories of setbacks and triumphs, celebrated each fraction of a point lowered on their A1C tests, and lifted one another when old cravings or bad news threatened to pull them back into despair. As his community grew, James realized something profound. The power of these three foods was not just in their ability to lower blood sugar, but in their ability to bring people together. Food was no longer the enemy. It was the common ground, the shared language of hope and healing. He saw families who hadn't cooked together in years gathering around stoves, rediscovering traditions with a healthy twist. He saw elderly neighbors teaching young parents how to season beans properly, and teenagers helping grandparents shop for greens at the farmer's market. Bonds were forming over cutting boards and soup pots, knitting a safety net that made the difference between giving up and pushing forward. James often found himself overwhelmed with gratitude. He had once stood on the precipice of losing everything he loved: his health, his independence, his dreams of seeing his daughter's future. Now every healthy meal was a testament to what could be achieved with knowledge, community, and the right foods. Every hug from a grateful neighbor reminded him that his struggle had a purpose far beyond himself. At night, as he sipped his cinnamon tea and looked out over the quiet street where he used to walk with dread, James reflected on a life transformed. He wasn't cured, and he never claimed to be, but he was living proof that dark leafy greens, cinnamon, and legumes could change the trajectory of a life once headed toward tragedy. And he vowed to spend every day he had left spreading that message to as many people as possible. James's journey stands as a beacon of hope for anyone who feels trapped by a diabetes diagnosis, proving that small, powerful changes can shift the course of a life. By embracing dark leafy greens, cinnamon, and legumes, he not only regained control over his blood sugar, but also discovered a sense of purpose and community that gave his life new meaning. His story reminds us that every meal is a chance to choose health, every bite a step toward a brighter, stronger future. And while there is no single cure for diabetes, there is always the possibility of reclaiming one's life, one simple, nourishing choice at a time. Medical disclaimer: this content is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. The information provided is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease and should not replace personalized guidance from a qualified healthcare professional. Always consult your doctor or a licensed medical provider before making any changes to your diet, exercise routine, or treatment plan, especially if you have or suspect you have a medical condition like diabetes. Viewer discretion is advised, and results may vary depending on individual health circumstances.